Very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. And let me congratulate the entire committee, the CME committee, for doing a wonderful job. So I'm going to discuss the role of the Mediterranean diet for weight control, optimal health, and longevity. And here's my disclosures. And so the objectives of my talk will be to discuss the role of the Mediterranean diet in improving cardiometabolic health, achieving weight control, and increasing longevity, as well as to review the clinical trials that support the Mediterranean diet, and finally to cite the key components of the Mediterranean diet that impact long-term health. So what I'd like to do in starting my lecture is have all of you put down your pen, put down your coffee cup, and turn and look at the person sitting right next to you. Look them right in the eye, because one of you is going to die from this condition. One of you will die from this condition. And what is this condition? So here we have, boy, that really got your attention. This is an atherosclerotic plaque that is ruptured. You could see the occluding thrombus. And this is the leading cause of death across the United States and worldwide. Every 30 seconds it strikes, and often strikes and hits people in the prime of their life. And certainly this disease is a disease that everybody fears. It's this ferocious beast. But I'm here to tell you today that we can take this ferocious beast and reduce it into a harmless pussycat. This is a preventable disease. And yes, we've made great strides, I'm a cardiologist, in our ability to lower the atherogenic lipoproteins. We have all kinds of new pharmaceutical drugs with, on the basis of genomics. We've come out with PCSK9 inhibitors. We've got coded stents. When you get this, if you're lucky enough to make it to the hospital, we can put in stents. And now we're doing minimally invasive bypass surgery. And that's all wonderful. But I think we're missing the boat, because the real treatment and prevention of this disease requires a knife, a fork, and a good pair of walking shoes. And so this was a great study by Kaplan and colleagues published in Lancet last year, looking at the hunter-gatherer tribe from the Bolivian Amazon. And what they did is they noticed that these people didn't have heart attacks. They didn't have strokes. And so they decided to do coronary calcium scanning on them and noticed that they all had 0 calcium scores, at least the vast majority of them, even those in the 8th and 9th decade of life, suggesting that there wasn't even any evidence of subclinical atherosclerosis. Well, how could that be? Well, we know that these people had the lowest reported levels of coronary artery disease of any population recorded to date. And it's clearly because of their lifestyle. That's where the money is in the lifestyle. And basically following a non-processed diet from the earth and the sea, a hunter-gatherer diet, they suggest that by doing that, they can achieve a lifetime of low LDL, low blood pressure, low glucose, normal body mass index, no smoking, and plenty of physical activity. So to me, this is evidence that we can use lifestyle intervention. And I got to tell you something, it really is neglected today by a lot of people around the country and around the world. They want the latest pill, the latest operative procedure. Well, we know that a Mediterranean diet is the modern day hunter-gatherer diet. It's non-processed food that I'm going to talk about, and it reduces inflammation and oxidative stress and all those things that I'm going to talk about. But very importantly, it stabilizes plaques. And I can almost promise those of you that live the typical American lifestyle all have atherosclerotic plaques right now. And whether they rupture or not depends on the stability of the plaque. And we know that the Mediterranean diet can stabilize unstable plaques. They can cause plaques to regress. And so that's, and I have all of this referenced in all of my handouts, and all of these articles are really interesting articles. But I will cover all of this, and if you have to go back, but this is a very interesting article. Our ability to stabilize plaques is key, because a stable plaque will never kill you. A ruptured plaque will. But how about preventing the plaque in the first place? Well, this study by Estruck and colleagues looked at long-term adherence to a Mediterranean diet decreases the development of an atherosclerotic plaque. And to me, there's an old saying that prevention is always better than the cure. So I would rather prevent plaques in my patients than wait for them to develop plaques, get into trouble, and it's like the Roach Motel. Once you check in, you never check out, from stents to nuclear stress tests and on and on and on. So what is it about the Mediterranean diet that is so effective in lowering the risk of not only cardiovascular disease, but a whole host of diseases? Well, as opposed to the toxic American diet, which is highly processed, calorie dense, and nutrient depleted, the Mediterranean diet improves lipid and lipoprotein profile, improves insulin sensitivity, lowers oxidative stress and inflammation, improves endothelial function, lowers thrombogenic risk, lowers blood pressure, and lowers the risk of metabolic syndrome. Well, who is this fella? Everybody remember Tim Russert? He was a noted reporter at NBC News and the first moderator at Meet the Press. And he had features of metabolic syndrome. He basically admitted that he really did not follow a healthy diet, wished he could exercise more. And one day in the newsroom, and by the way, he was taking a statin, and his LDL cholesterol was 67 milligrams per deciliter. That's very low. One day in the newsroom, about 10 years ago, he fell down from his desk and had a massive heart attack, sudden cardiac death. And everybody was aghast. How can this happen in somebody with such a low LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol? Well, he had high triglycerides and low HDL. He had increased inflammation. He had a lot of the features of metabolic syndrome, increased waist circumference. And we know that we're very statin-centric in this country. And statins are great drugs. I love them. But you know something? They lower risk by 35%. And how about the 65% that go on to have heart attacks? There are a lot of people who take these statin medications and say, wow, this is great. Now I can go to all these fast food restaurants. I don't have to exercise because I'm on a statin. Well, it doesn't work that way. And it's like taking your car in for a tune-up. You're very compulsive because you want your car to last a long time. So every 6 months you get the oil change, the points and plugs, all of the things that you do. But then when you pick up your car, you take it into the gas station and you fill it up with diesel fuel. And you wonder why this isn't working. Your car's still breaking down. Well, you're putting the wrong fuel in the gas tank. And what we're doing in this country and around the world, we're putting the wrong fuel in our own gas tank. We're eating this highly processed food that's making us sick. Well, how about women? Women, whether you know this or not, the leading cause of death, not only for men, but for women, is cardiovascular disease. And here's the evidence. Here's women at midlife, around menopause, and you see a spike in the blue line, which reflects death from heart attack, a spike in the yellow line, death from stroke, and it dwarfs all these other causes of death, including breast cancer. And so what I'm going to be talking about today, the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle, is effective for men and women. I can drown you with evidence of the benefits of a Mediterranean diet in women, and especially, this should be a lifelong process, but especially as women hit midlife is when the risk really accelerates, and you can mitigate that risk with the Mediterranean diet. So we are at the dawn of a new era in cardiovascular medicine. And that era is that atherosclerosis is no longer considered a bland cholesterol storage disease. a gradual buildup of sludge in your arteries until it chokes off the artery and you have a heart attack. That's really not what happens. You get small plaques that are highly inflamed, you get a rupture, and you go from a 10% plaque to a 100% plaque in a matter of 5 seconds from the clot that ensues. But the root cause of atherosclerosis is retention of ApoB, atherogenic ApoB lipoproteins, followed by a maladaptive inflammatory response. And finally, that cardiovascular disease prevention with lifestyle intervention and medical therapy is truly the optimal approach to treat, to prevent, and indeed to reverse atherosclerosis. So this was a study by O'Keefe and colleagues. It looked at the typical Western or American diet, what I call the toxic American diet, and shortly after eating this type of a diet, you get a spike in glucose and triglycerides, which overwhelms the metabolic capabilities of the mitochondria. You get free radicals, inflammation, oxidative stress, on, endothelial dysfunction, and it culminates in cardiovascular disease. So this is what they did. They also looked at, they took people, they had them eat their typical highly processed diet. They saw a spike in glucose and a spike in triglycerides immediately after the meal, with a concomitant increase in inflammation, as reflected by a rise in CRP, increase in oxidative stress, as reflected by nitrotyrosine, and a decrease in endothelial function, as reflected by flow-mediated dilation. Well, I can stand here and tell you that a Mediterranean diet, after countless, literally thousands of studies worldwide over the past 5 decades, has been shown to be the optimal diet for the prevention of cardiometabolic disease. So what is a Mediterranean diet? Well, it's really a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle, and of course, the base is physical daily activity, but it's whole grains instead of refined grains. It's a wide variety of fruits and vegetables that bring different antioxidants to the table. It's nuts, seeds, and legumes. Legumes bring a lot of fiber and protein to the table. Extra virgin olive oil, it's rich in polyphenols. Cold water fish, that it's rich in omega-3 fatty acids that I'm going to talk about. And very low consumption of meat, red meat in particular. It also, often they'll have a glass of red wine with meals, and it's very important that it's consumed with meals, as I'm going to discuss. And the beverage of choice throughout the day is water. So Walter Willett from the Harvard School of Public Health came out with a 9-point scale and said the Mediterranean diet is truly a model for healthy eating, which consisted of plant foods, as I discussed. Fresh fruit is the typical daily dessert. Olive oil as the principal source of fat. Dairy products in moderation, fish, cold water fish, especially as we discussed, and poultry, eggs in moderation, red meat consumed infrequently, and wine consumed with meals. This diet is low in saturated fat, but it's not a low-fat diet. In fact, 25 to 35% of the energy comes from fat, but the fat is polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat. The other thing that's important is to understand our evolution. Now, early man suffered from diseases of undernutrition. So we had to have a tissue in our body that protected us for times of famine and starvation. And the way that this was accomplished was by adipose tissue, to store fat in the form of triglycerides so that at the time of famine we wouldn't have perished from starvation. But modern man suffers from diseases of overnutrition. And that very same tissue that saved us from extinction is now killing us. So, what is adipose tissue? Adipose tissue is connective tissue composed mostly of adipocytes and a stromal vascular fraction, and it contains preadipocytes, endothelial cells, and a host of other different types of cells. what is adiposopathy or sick fat? And it's very important that you understand this because adiposopathy or sick fat is dysfunctional fat that's promoted by an unhealthy diet and physical inactivity in genetically susceptible individuals that result in increase in cardiometabolic risk and promote cardiovascular disease. So our adipose tissue contains adipocytes, and if there's contained in healthy areas of the body and healthy areas or subcutaneous tissue, these adipocytes mainly pour out, release adipokines, specifically adiponectin, which is an anti-atherogenic adipokine. However, as we gain weight and we end up with adipocytes moving to the belly and we get visceral adiposity, they become dysfunctional and they release adipokines that are pro-atherogenic and decrease the amount of adiponectin. And these pro-atherogenic adipokines can lead to metabolic syndrome, thrombosis, inflammation, hypertension, and on, and serve to not only increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, but clearly increase the risk of metabolic syndrome. Now, this is a great article from Jack, and the author is Dr. Harold Bays, and I know Harold has done a lot in this field, and this is a must-read for all of you. But he goes through the pathway, and what basically happens is as we lead this unhealthy lifestyle and increase the amount of highly processed food and lack of exercise, we get more and more fat in the form of triglycerides that are being stored in the adipocytes and the subcutaneous adipocytes, and they increase in size. They develop what we call adipocyte hypertrophy. That leads to intraorganelle stress. That really leads to dysfunction of the endoplasmic reticulum, which leads to insulin resistance. That takes the brake off of lipolysis. That leads to mobilization of free fatty acids. Okay, now the free fatty acids hitch a ride on albumin, and they create not only visceral adiposity, but they go to tissue and they harm tissue. So they'll go to the pancreas. It's what we call lipotoxicity, and it'll lead to beta cell dysfunction, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. They'll go to the liver and cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and ultimately cirrhosis. They can go to the kidneys and cause renal insufficiency. And certainly they can go to the blood vessels and be deposited as perivascular fat, leading to inflammation, leading to endothelial dysfunction, and leading to another pathway for atherogenesis and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So one of the things I will tell you is adiposopathy is the gateway to metabolic syndrome. And when these free fatty acids go to the liver pumps out triglyceride-rich VLDL particles. And these particles will swap their triglycerides with cholesterol from LDL and HDL. And then when acted upon by lipases, this results in small, dense, more pro-atherogenic LDL particles and small, dense, less functional HDL particles. It also increases the number of remnant lipoproteins. And remnant lipoproteins are highly atherogenic. So we could see how adiposopathy can contribute to atherogenic dyslipidemia and contribute to cardiovascular disease. We also know that metabolic syndrome, I think everybody in this room knows the definition. You have to have 3 of the following as listed. But notice how abdominal obesity is defined as waist circumference. And just as a quick note, I think we really have not, a measuring tape costs about 3 cents. It takes about 10 seconds to do in your patients, and it's more precise in predicting risk of cardiovascular disease than is either body weight or BMI. So that's part of the criteria for metabolic syndrome, along with high triglyceride, low HDL, increased blood pressure, and impaired fasting glucose. So, so what if you get metabolic syndrome? Well, this is the so what. You significantly increase your risk of cardiovascular mortality if you have metabolic syndrome. And what is the antidote? It turns out the Mediterranean diet is the antidote to metabolic syndrome. This was a study by Catherine Esposito and colleagues published in JAMA a few years ago that took Mediterranean diet versus a control diet and noted that in patients who had features of metabolic syndrome, and noted there was a significant reduction in body weight, insulin resistance, blood glucose, inflammatory markers, and blood pressure compared to the control diet, which was a low-fat diet, and a significant improvement in the lipid profile as well as endothelial function, and after 1 year, a 50% reduction in those people who had metabolic syndrome no longer had metabolic syndrome. Now, as far as weight reduction, this was a study by Shea and colleagues published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years ago, and it showed that all diets, they looked at a vegetarian diet, basically they looked at a low-fat diet, a low-carb diet, and a Mediterranean diet. All these diets resulted in weight loss. The thing I want to point out is the Mediterranean diet was as effective in all these diets, and actually the low-carb Mediterranean were more effective than the low-fat diet in weight loss. But notice at 12 and 24 months, no significant difference between a Mediterranean diet and a low-carb diet, but there is a significant difference in long-term health. So this was a study that was published by Sophie and colleagues that looked at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but the conclusion was that among all the diets that have been proposed, a Mediterranean diet was the most effective dietary option for inducing weight loss, together with the beneficial effects on all the risk factors associated with metabolic syndrome. And I think that's very important. And I'll discuss why a Mediterranean diet is so effective in weight loss. It's non-processed food. It certainly contains no sugar or refined starches. It certainly has plenty of fiber, and we could talk about this all day long. But suffice it to say that, in my opinion, you want to have a diet that not only gets your patients to lose weight and maintain long-term weight loss, and a diet that's available for the entire family, from the very young to the very old, to people who have had heart attacks, but you also want a diet that keeps people healthy. Now, another thing about a Mediterranean diet is that it's very rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and that's very important. It's more important and I'm going to discuss that in a little bit, but one of the things, in fact, of all the diets, it has the highest concentration of omega-3 fatty acids, both plant-based and marine omega-3s, than the other dietary patterns that are out there. And that's important because if you look at adiposopathy, one of the things that a Mediterranean diet and of course the omega-3 fatty acids that are in it attenuate adipocyte tissue inflammation and dysfunction. Well, how about the clinical trials that support a Mediterranean diet? And I could literally be up here all day long. You'd probably be throwing tomatoes at me, but it certainly, I picked some of the highlights, and the NIH AARP study showed that the more closely people in America adhered to a Mediterranean diet, the more they decreased their mortality risk. That was a big trial by Matrow and colleagues, and where they stated at the end that resorting to drug therapy for an epidemic caused by a maladaptive diet is less rational than realigning our eating habits with our physiologic needs. The HALE project looked at a series of elderly people between 70 and 90 and noted that adhering to a Mediterranean diet in this elderly cohort was associated with a significant 50% lower rate of all-cause and cause-specific mortality. The GZ Prevention trial looked at individuals post-myocardial infarction, men and women post-MI, and those that were placed on a Mediterranean diet had a significant reduction in mortality, and especially early death. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. This was a huge trial by Castorini and his colleagues, and there was a meta-analysis of 50 studies and over 500,000 individuals, and they concluded that a Mediterranean diet was associated with a 30% reduction in the risk of developing metabolic syndrome. And this was a primary prevention study that looked at individuals who were randomized to a Mediterranean diet versus a low-fat diet called the PREDIMED trial. And this trial was actually stopped prematurely because it was not considered appropriate to continue since there was such a significant reduction in cardiovascular risk in those individuals randomized to a Mediterranean diet. And we're talking about heart attack, stroke, fatal and non-fatal MI. So the conclusion was that 30% of major cardiovascular disease events can be prevented in high-risk individuals if they simply switch to a Mediterranean-style diet. And by the way, that also held true in those people who were on statins. So this is incremental benefit. And that's why I go back to what I said at the beginning. The first step in our approach with our patients should be lifestyle intervention. Want to add statins because we don't get them to the goal we want, that's fine. But it doesn't start with the statins first and then adding lifestyle. And this just indicates that it's no one thing about the Mediterranean diet that was so effective in the PREDIMED study. It's not just the olive oil or the nuts or the legumes. It's a combination of everything. How about diabetes? In the PREDIMED trial, they looked at diabetes, and they noted that those individuals on the Mediterranean diet reduced the risk of diabetes by 52% compared to the control group. Oxidized LDL, which is highly atherogenic. When LDL particles get oxidized, hide the women and children because it's very highly atherogenic. And it was significantly reduced in the Mediterranean diet, especially with extra virgin olive oil. Inflammation was reduced as reflected by C-reactive protein. Weight obviously went down, endothelial function went up, and total cholesterol was significantly reduced. Which led, after this study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the next day in the New York Times was stated that this is a watershed moment in the field of nutrition. For the first time, a diet has been shown to be as effective as drugs in preventing what really matters to patients: heart attacks, strokes, and death from cardiovascular disease. So there was another trial which was, you should know about, called the Lyon Heart Trial from Lyon, France. And the conclusion of this trial was the Mediterranean dietary pattern was maintained up to 4 years, and these were people post-myocardial infarction. But look at this data. Compared to the control group, a 45% reduction in total mortality compared to the control group in this high-risk cohort of patients post-MI, and a 70% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular mortality. That's huge. For those of you that are interested in neurodegenerative diseases, we know also this study from Nicholas Skarmeas and his group from Columbia Presbyterian published this data looking at the Mediterranean diet and the risk for Alzheimer's disease, and concluded that higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet is associated with a 40% reduction in the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, as you know, once it takes hold, yeah, there are medications out there. It's very difficult to treat patients who already have it. Why not prevent it? This study was interesting by Coops and colleagues that looked at longevity and felt that the four most important factors was a big study that Mediterranean diet with regular exercise, no tobacco, light to moderate alcohol, reduce all-cause mortality by 65%. Another study by Franco, published in British Medical Journal, following a Mediterranean-style diet, lowering cardiovascular risk by 76%. And this study by Trikopoulou and his group showed that not only did the Mediterranean diet lower cardiovascular events, but it also decreased cancer mortality. And you got to understand that we don't have heart disease here and cancer over here, but these diseases are intimately linked to one another, because certainly if you could lower oxidative stress, free radicals, inflammation, you're going to also lower the risk of cancer. And his statement was that, and from this trial, was that by lowering both the risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer, you certainly improve longevity. And this study was a large study in an elderly cohort that showed closer adherence to the Mediterranean diet was associated with prolonged survival in this elderly population. For those of you that are interested in anti-aging, you know that telomere length and the rate of telomere shortening are biomarkers for aging. Well, it's been shown that high adherence to a Mediterranean diet was associated with maintenance of telomere length and helps to explain how a Mediterranean diet is linked with longevity. And there's this concept of healthy aging, and it was shown that greater adherence to the Mediterranean diet in midlife was associated with a 46% greater odds of healthy aging, which we define as hitting the age of 70 with no significant impairment in physical function or mental health. So, who is this woman on the left? Well, this woman happens to be a CEO of a major international women's fashion industry company, and her parents emigrated to this country from the south of France, and she's followed a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle her whole life. And why am I telling you this? Because this woman happens to be my mother. Standing next to her is my daughter, when we gathered together as a family a couple of years ago to celebrate her 96th birthday. And a couple of weeks ago, she turned 101 and was just elected as president of the Greater Miami Poetry Society. So, now, I'm not telling you this as a clinical trial. I'm making a point here that it's what people want out of life. People don't want to say, well, gee, I want to live to be 100, but my last 20 years I want to be in a nursing home. Or I don't want to, I'll be confined to a wheelchair. No, people want to be active. And that's really, if you look at the Mediterranean regions of the world, that's really what we know. They live long, healthy lives, fully active, still working in their gardens. And I think that's what most people want. Not only a long life, but a healthy one so they can enjoy their life with their families. So let's take a deep dive, and it's not going to be too deep in the interest of time, into the components of a Mediterranean diet that make it so healthy. And of course, I had to pare this down a little because otherwise I'd be here till 6 p.m. and I don't think Bill would like that. So here's the highlights. So red wine. Red wine it certainly has been shown to lower cardiovascular risk, raises HDL, has anti-inflammatory function. You know it has antioxidant function. Resveratrol's, the rich supply of resveratrol in red wine and other antioxidants, antithrombotic, and very importantly, if it's consumed with meals, it decreases postprandial glucose. Vinegar, which in French means sour wine, actually is also very healthy and probably not used as much as it should be. It delays gastric emptying, delays carbohydrate absorption, reduces postprandial glucose, lowers meal-induced oxidative stress, and prolongs satiety. Olive oil, I can spend a lot of time and go through this whole thing. I could spend an hour on extra virgin olive oil, but that's what I am going to spend time right now is tell you that one of the problems with olive oil is that most people who buy olive oil off the shelf don't know what they're buying. And if it's processed olive oil, you could throw all these benefits out the window. So you want to make sure that what you're buying is an extra virgin cold-pressed olive oil. Now, there was the olive oil scandal a couple of years ago. I don't know if you know about this in Europe, that a lot of this olive oil was highly processed. So how do you know? How's the consumer to know? Well, it's very difficult because the FDA has nothing to do with this, nor does the dietary committees. But what you can do is let the buyer beware. And in this country, there is entities, probably the most known is the California Olive Oil Council, which I have no affiliation with. But they're excellent because they go out, and if somebody was producing olive oil in the United States, they will take samples, they'll see the percent of polyphenols. There's about 10 steps that you have to jump through to get their seal. The best part is you could look this up online under California Olive Oil Council, for free and see if this, whatever you're buying is certified. That's really the only way you're going to know. So I think it's very important. It's a very important point because, in order to get the antioxidant and antithrombotic, anti-inflammatory effects, it has it's been shown to help prevent breast cancer and a whole litany of other things. Olive oil is extremely healthy, and in the Mediterranean diet, it certainly is used in place of butter and lard. Nuts. Nut consumption is a very important topic because nuts are very, very healthy. And we know that there's been 5 major nut studies. These are cohort studies from the Adventist trial, Iowa Women's Health Study, Nurses Health Study. All these trials showed that nuts lowered the CHD risk by 45%. And of course, nuts are rich in both monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat, lower LDL levels. This is the Adventist Health Study, which showed that those who consume nuts at least 4 times a week, a good handful or more of nuts, substantially lowered their risk of coronary heart disease. Now, fruits and vegetables. Well, I'm not going to spend any time telling this audience of the benefits of fruits and vegetables. Of course that's needed for health. There's minerals, vitamins, antioxidants of all types of fruits and vegetables of all different colors. A lot of people out there say, well, I don't want to eat that because I'll gain weight. Well, you really. Look at the Nurses Health Study. These looked at middle-aged women over a 12-year period, and they found that increase in intake of fruits and vegetables reduce long-term risk of obesity and weight gain among middle-aged women. Very importantly, we're not talking about processed fruits and vegetables. A lot of people will drink a lot of fruit juice. You're stripping away the fiber. We're talking about the whole fruit, and I think that's a very important point. When I'm talking to patients, I tell them, forget about the blender and these things that are chopping up the fiber and doing a lot of other things to take away some of the beneficial aspects of fruits and vegetables. Omega-3 fatty acids, I say, is of critical importance, and why is that? Well, I bet a lot of you weren't aware of this. Deficiency of omega-3 fatty acids, namely low omega-3 blood levels, is one of the top 10 preventable causes of death in America. And this led Mozaffarian and colleagues from Boston to state that modest consumption of fish or fish oil, together with smoking cessation and regular physical activity, should be among the first-line treatments for the prevention of CHD, death, and especially sudden cardiac death. So if you look at the mechanisms of action, and this was a great article by De Caterina in the New England Journal a couple of years ago, but omega-3 fatty acids lower triglycerides, reduce inflammation, lower blood pressure, lower resting heart rate, and the susceptibility for ventricular fibrillation. They stabilize the ion channels in the heart, and they lower ventricular fibrillation threshold. And that is of really importance for people that often will rupture a plaque, have a little bit of ischemia, but because of the low omega-3, they'll fibrillate and die. So having the low, and by the way, the Japanese have very high omega-3 levels. Their likelihood or their incidence of sudden cardiac death is extremely low compared to the United States, which is half their level because they eat more fish. It also, omega-3 improves insulin sensitivity and does other things. The last one there is reduces feature of an inflammatory atherosclerotic plaque is critical because what it does is by doing that, you certainly will decrease the likelihood of a plaque rupture. And there was a big study called the Cherry trial, which hammered home that point. The physician's health study showed that one fish meal a week reduced the risk of sudden cardiac death by 52%. Here's the study by Christine Albert and Paul Ritker from Harvard that showed that, look at these results, they're amazing. If you are in the highest quartile of omega-3 blood level, you have a 90% reduction in risk of sudden cardiac death compared to those in the lowest quartile. That's huge. And, you know, I'm going to go over these slides quickly, so I'll finish on time. But the Nurses' Health Study showed huge trial, 85,000 women, higher consumption of fish and omega-3, lower risk of CHD and CHD death. These are some of the epidemiological studies, over 250,000 participants, same thing. Inverse association between fish consumption and morbidity and mortality from CHD. The DART trial looked at people post-MI. After 20 years, they showed an almost 30% reduction in CHD mortality. The GZ Prevention trial, which took patients post-MI and gave them one capsule of omega-3, 850 milligrams of EPA and DHA, and noted a significant 30% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. But look at this, 45% reduction in sudden cardiac death at only 4 months. You're stabilizing the membranes, you're reducing the risk of sudden cardiac death, ventricular fibrillation. Stroke, we know that there is an inverse relationship between omega-3 fatty acids and thrombotic, not hemorrhagic, but thrombotic stroke. That was published in JAMA. Here's another study showing the same thing in NHANES. We know that fiber is extremely important. You know, men should be eating at least 30 grams of fiber, women at least 25 grams of fiber a day. We're lucky if we eat half of that. And why is fiber so important? Not only decreases inflammation, lowers LDL, lowers oxidation, improves insulin sensitivity, and helps certainly with weight control and reduced incidence of obesity and metabolic syndrome, but very importantly, and I wish I had 3 hours, I'd talk about one of my favorite topics, but is the gut microbiome, and it has beneficial impact on gut flora. This was a study by Willett and his colleagues that showed after myocardial infarction, those that ate the most fiber had a 25% reduction in mortality. Certainly, we know that as far as whole grains, if they're whole grains is associated with weight loss and lower incidence of obesity, but if they're instead of whole grains or refined grains, it's just the opposite. And here's looking at cardiovascular mortality. You know, from cereal fiber and legume fiber especially, are associated with a decrease in all-cause mortality and a decrease in cardiovascular mortality. I could talk a lot about this, my beef with beef, but it's not that the Mediterranean diet doesn't allow, that people can't eat red meat, but they certainly do so in moderation. And a lot of it has to do with a couple things you may not be aware of. One is heme iron. Red meat, which is only found in, heme iron is only found in red meat, is associated with a 57% increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's not all has to do with the red meat contains saturated fat. The heme iron is very important. And this is another very important thing. Stanley Hazen and his group at the Cleveland Clinic, with tremendous work they've done with the gut microbiome, has shown that red meat contains carnitine and choline, which is taken up by intestinal bacteria and leads to production of TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, which increases the risk of thrombosis and atherosclerosis. A Mediterranean diet, the higher adherence to Mediterranean diet significantly lowers TMAO levels. This is a huge trial by Sinya and his colleagues that show that more than 250,000 men, 250,000 women eating 5 ounces of red meat once a day versus once a week showed a significant increase in cardiovascular mortality and cancer mortality. And extrapolated to all Americans, they concluded that you could save more than 1 million lives just by eating less red meat and processed meats. Should saturated fat be reduced in a heart-healthy diet? Well, this study looked at butter compared to vegetable oil and noted that a significant reduction in not only cholesterol and LDL and triglycerides, but a significant reduction in what I talked about at the beginning of my talk, which is these atherogenic ApoB lipoproteins by almost 30%, simply by going from butter to oils that are rich in polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat. So dietary recommendations should emphasize substitution of polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat. Walk away, this slide becomes of critical importance that you understand this slide, Because anytime you change somebody's diet, what we're really talking about, what are you going to replace it with? So if you tell somebody, I want you to lower your intake of saturated fat, if you replace the saturated fat with sugar, refined starches, or certainly refined grains, you are not going to benefit the patient. But if you tell them to replace the saturated fat with monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, or whole grains, you significantly lower the risk of coronary heart disease. That's very important. And the same thing, it works the other way too. If somebody's consuming a lot of sugar and refined starches, and you replace that with saturated fat, trans fat, you're not going to lower cardiovascular risk or mortality to any significant degree. But if you replace it, again, with polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and whole grains, you will. So the risk of coronary heart disease is certainly reduced, as I'm just talking about fats, is when saturated fats are replaced with polyunsaturated fats. And I could go on and tell you how saturated fats affect the LDL receptor and downregulate it and cause lipids and lipoproteins. But essentially, what it boils down to is you can certainly improve outcome with that. And it's also been shown that adherence to a Mediterranean diet is also important for lowering cancer mortality that I discussed earlier. This was a recent study reported about a year ago, and that data is pretty impressive, along with a Mediterranean diet to reduce chronic inflammatory diseases is very effective in lowering the risk of chronic inflammatory diseases. So in conclusion, therapeutic lifestyle intervention is truly the first-line approach for achieving optimal long-term health. And a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle has been shown to control body weight, improve cardiometabolic health, and lower the risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And I'd like to end my talk with a great quote from Demetrius. And who's Demetrius? Demetrius is a peasant living on the island of Crete, off the Greek Isles, off of Greece. And when he celebrated his 100th birthday, this appeared in the village newspaper. They asked him, Demetrius, what is the secret for your longevity? And his response was, I walk every day, I work in my garden, and I eat fresh food from the earth and sea, and I enjoy my midday meal with a glass of wine surrounded by my family and friends. Well, Demetrius, I couldn't say it any better. Thank you very much.